The flames of faith consumed entire empires. The 30 Years' War was not merely political. It was an invisible crusade where angels and demons seemed to march alongside armies. And from it, the Europe we know today was born. 4 centuries ago, Europe trembled before a spiritual war that seemed to have no end. It wasn't just about borders. It was about the soul of a continent. Kings, emperors, and cardinals wielded the cross as a sword, while entire peoples were sacrificed in the name of rival beliefs. What began with a spark in Prague turned into a storm that would forever redraw the map of the West. And what if I told you that the modern world was born out of this field of ruins? You are watching Faith and Power, the channel where we unveil the secrets between empires and Christian faith. If you want to see the past through eyes of revelation, subscribe now and don't miss this story that never reached the altar. In the heart of Prague, in the year 1618, the air was heavy with distrust, as if heaven itself were holding its breath. Bohemia was a powder keg. Protestant nobles glared with hatred at the Catholic representatives of the emperor. The Habsburg Empire, guardian of Roman Catholicism, seemed determined to crush the Reformation within its lands. But faith does not bow easily. Inside Prague Castle, armed and resolute men marched toward a destiny that would change the course of history. In that moment, religion was not just a belief. It was gunpowder. It was a sword. It was destiny. The emperor's delegates were accused of betraying promises of religious freedom. Tension escalated. The chamber boiled with accusations. And then, as if human rage were fuel for the invisible, the scene occurred that would mark the beginning of the 30 Years' War. 2 Catholic representatives were seized and thrown out of the castle window. They fell more than 50 feet. Incredibly, they survived. Catholics called it a miracle, the protection of the Virgin Mary. Protestants mocked, saying they had landed on a dung heap in the courtyard. What seemed like a rash impulse turned into a sign. The spiritual world had manifested in the realm of politics. This scene, known as the Defenestration of Prague, was not just an act of rebellion. It was the spark that ignited a war-blending faith, power, and blood in proportions never seen before. From that moment on, every battle ceased to be merely a territorial dispute. It was holy war, cosmic war, war for the soul of Europe. The historian C.V. Wedgwood wrote that this war was the last great struggle in which religion and politics were still inseparable. It was as if the devil and the angels marched alongside human troops. Bohemia was set aflame. The Protestant nobles proclaimed their own king, Frederick V, the so-called Winter King, hoping his reign would shine as brightly as it was brief. This act directly defied Habsburg power. Emperor Ferdinand II, a devout Catholic, saw not just political rebellion, he saw heretics trying to overthrow God's order. His response was crushing. The imperial army, commanded by generals such as Tilly, advanced on Protestant lands with fire and sword. Churches became fortresses, cities turned into cemeteries, and the European countryside began to be watered with blood. But don't think this was only a struggle for thrones. Behind the Baitaas smoke curtain, the true battle was spiritual. For Protestants, it was the chance to prove the Reformation could not be erased. For Catholics, it was the sacred mission to restore the unity of faith. Each sermon in the pulpits inflamed crowds. Each preacher called soldiers to see themselves as heavenly warriors. The battlefields were seen as altars where the sacrifice of human lives was offered in the name of truth, or what each side believed to be the truth. War hymns echoed like armed prayers. Troops marched singing psalms, believing every step was guided by God. But faith, transformed into gunpowder, unleashed a violence that seemed to deny the very gospel they professed. Men who quoted Christ before battle did not hesitate to plunder churches, violate innocents, and burn entire villages. It was as if the cross had been turned into a spear. The spiritual war was not only in the heavens, it was etched on the faces of peasants watching their homes go up in flames. And here arises the disturbing question, where was God in the midst of this tragedy? For Protestants, God allowed the trial as a test of faithfulness. For Catholics, it was punishment against heresy. But for the innocents, crushed beneath the weight of the powerful's faith, the inner conflict was inevitable. Many wondered if the cross had been hijacked by the throne. To what extent did faith serve God, and to what extent was it merely a mask for imperial ambition? The Bohemian War was only the beginning, but it revealed a terrible pattern. The explosive mixture of spirituality and politics created monsters. The Battle of White Mountain in 1620 cemented the Catholic victory over the rebels. Frederick V fled, becoming a king without a kingdom, a symbol of defeat. Bohemian Protestants were persecuted, their churches closed, their properties seized. For Ferdinand II, this was the triumph of the Catholic faith. But for Protestant Europe, it was only the first act of a greater tragedy, and every defeat only further fueled the desire to resist. At this point, the war ceased to be local and began to draw the attention of all Europe. The spiritual fire that began in a Prague window was about to cross borders, attracting German princes, Scandinavian kings, French cardinals, and eventually nearly every power on the continent. What had seemed a mere Bohemian quarrel was, in fact, the prelude to a European apocalypse. Spiritual war was becoming total war, and perhaps the most frightening detail is this. On both sides, people believed they were fighting for the true Christ. But when Christ is used as a banner of war, the cross becomes a battlefield. From that moment on, Europe would never be the same. The map would be redrawn not only by generals, but by invisible angels and demons working behind kings and cardinals. The Defenestration of Prague was more than an act of rebellion. It was the opening of a portal to 30 years of darkness. And you, viewer, must ask yourself, if faith was powerful enough to turn Europe into ruins, what might it still be able to transform today? The echo of White Mountain did not remain confined to Bohemia. It reverberated across Europe like a thunderclap, announcing a storm. What seemed to be a decisive Catholic victory proved to be only the beginning of a whirlwind. At the center of this new act stood the tragic figure of Frederick V, the Calvinist prince who had accepted the throne of Bohemia, believing his coronation would be the triumph of the Reformed faith. Ironically nicknamed the Winter King, he ruled for only a year before being driven out in defeat. His flight symbolized not only the fall of one man, but the fragility of an entire cause. To his enemies, he was proof that God's hand weighed against the rebels. To his allies, he was a political martyr, a victim of imperial tyranny. Behind Frederick's throne stood his wife, Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of the King of England. A woman of iron resolve, she would become known as the Queen of Protestant Hearts. For her, exile was not an end, but a calling to turn her family into a symbol of resistance against the Habsburgs. In fiery letters, she exhorted Protestant princes not to abandon the struggle. Thus, the seemingly defeated Bohemian cause rose, again as a spiritual banner for the rest of Europe. Emperor Ferdinand II, for his part, did not hide his aim, to crush heresy wherever it was found. With the support of the Catholic League, led by Duke Maximilian of Bavaria and General Tilly, he launched a campaign that extended far beyond Bohemia. The Palatinate, Frederick's homeland, was devastated. Entire populations fled before armies. That made no distinction between enemy soldiers and defenseless peasants. Villages were burned, Protestant churches desecrated, and the message was clear. Resistance meant annihilation. The Palatinate became a field of ruins, a scorched land where the cross and the crown merged into symbols of power and fear. And here, the terrible paradox of this war became clear. While princes claimed to defend the faith, the armies marching in Christ's name committed atrocities that disfigured the very gospel they professed. Sermons called the struggle holy, But what the eyes saw was the misery of widows, orphans, and refugees dragging themselves along the roads in search of bread. Amid this devastation, a burning question arose in the hearts of the people. Was God truly on the side of the victors? The inner conflict became inevitable. For many Catholics, imperial victories were signs of divine providence. For many Protestants, they were only proof that the cross had been hijacked by the throne. This dilemma gnawed at the soul of Europe, and even as blood soaked the fields, an invisible war raged in the pulpits. Preachers inflamed crowds, calling them to fight to their last breath. Every sermon became a banner raised against the unseen enemy. Meanwhile, the courts of Europe watched in calculating silence. King James I of England hesitated to intervene directly to save his daughter Elizabeth and his son-in-law Frederick. Spain, the powerful arm of the Habsburgs, seized the moment to advance its ambitions in the Netherlands, and the German Protestant princes, torn between fear and hope, wavered. The stage was set for a continental drama, but the opening acts revealed a brutal imbalance. The Catholic League advanced with discipline and conviction, while the Protestants appeared fragmented. It was in this context that an almost legendary figure emerged, Ernst von Mansfeld, one of the first Protestant commanders who tried to resist the Catholic advance. His troops, however, were poorly paid, undisciplined, and often more interested in plundering than fighting. This gap between ideal and reality would become a hallmark of the war. Lofty speeches of faith, followed by practices that betrayed the very principles they claimed to defend. The spiritual war was tainted with greed, hunger, and despair, yet the true clash was still to come. In 1625, King Christian IV of Denmark decided to intervene, fearing the Habsburg advance would suffocate Protestantism across the region. His army seemed promising, and many believed the balance would finally tip. But the imperial forces, reinforced by mercenaries under the enigmatic General Wallenstein, proved relentless. Christian IV suffered devastating defeats, and once again, Protestantism seemed on the brink of collapse. With each defeat, however, the flame of resistance did not die. It only changed form. Reports of atrocities committed by Catholic armies spread like wildfire, igniting popular outrage. Pamphlets circulated, denouncing imperial tyranny. And here we see the hidden power of words. Even in times of war, ideas were weapons as sharp as swords. The historian Peter H. Wilson notes that the 30 Years' War was as much a battle of perceptions as of cannons. Each side had to convince not only its soldiers but also the people that they were fighting for the true cause. It was a war for souls, waged both on the battlefield and in the hearts of men. At this point, one question hovered over Europe. Had faith become nothing more than a pretext for political ambition? Cardinal Richelieu himself, soon to enter the stage, would later write that reason of state must prevail over religion. But for now, the public narrative was one of spiritual crusade. The cross adorned military standards, yet its message of love seemed lost beneath the thunder of war drums. As the years passed, Europe sank deeper into the abyss. The devastated Palatinate became both a symbol of a betrayed cause and a banner of hope. Elizabeth Stuart and her children, exiled, were hailed as the family of faith. Pamphlets circulated portraying them as modern martyrs, destined to return in glory. The spiritual war was fueled not only by gunpowder, but also by myths and dreams. Yet the human cost was unbearable. Famines spread. Disease ravaged both armies and villages, killing more than the battles themselves. For every clash between generals, thousands of peasants were reduced to living skeletons, surviving on tree bark and roots dug from the soil. Some accounts speak of entire villages where the population either died or fled, leaving behind nothing but silent ruins. The continent was becoming a desert, spiritually and physically, and in the midst of this desert a promise of change arose. For although Catholic power seemed unbreakable, the forces of the North, under the leadership of a warrior king, were about to enter the stage. The roar that would echo across the battlefields would not come from cardinals or wavering German princes, but from a Lutheran monarch determined to save the Reformed cause. His name was Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, and his entrance into the war would change everything. The Baltic wind carried a new protagonist into Central Europe, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, known to many as the Lion of the North. Young, energetic, and deeply Lutheran, he saw the 30 Years' War not merely as politics, but as a divine mission. When he landed with his army in 1630, he proclaimed that he came not to conquer, but to liberate the Protestant faith from Habsburg tyranny. His arrival sounded like an apocalyptic trumpet, a roar that promised to turn the course of the war. The Swedish king was more than a devout believer. He was also a military genius. His light artillery, iron discipline, and innovative tactics stunned the continent's generals. While imperial armies still relied on slow, rigid formations, Gustavus introduced speed, flexibility, and coordination never seen before. Soldiers trained to respond like precise gears, bound together by hymns that blended faith and courage. The spiritual war took on a new shape. It seemed as though God himself had forged this army as a sword against the Catholic Empire. The decisive moment came at Breitenfeld in 1631. There, the fate of European Protestantism hung in the balance. The imperial army, commanded by Tilly, believed it possessed both numerical and divine superiority. But Gustavus Adolphus, relying as much on strategy as on faith, led one of the most remarkable battles in history. As Swedish cannons roared, soldiers sang psalms. The battlefield became a bloody cathedral where every volley felt like a prayer. The result was devastating. Tilly suffered a crushing defeat, and the myth of imperial invincibility crumbled. For the first time in years, Protestant hope blazed bright. That victory was not only military, it was theological. Pamphlets spread across Europe, portraying Gustavus as a divine instrument, almost a new Joshua leading God's people to triumph. Preachers declared that God had once again descended to fight. The roar of the Lion of the North echoed not only on battlefields, but also in churches, inflaming hearts to believe that the end of oppression was near. Yet with hope also came temptation. Every Swedish advance drew ambitious allies. Princes who saw political opportunity more than devotion. And here the spiritual dilemma returned. To what extent was this war truly Christ's, and not simply that of kings disguised as prophets? The glory of victory could also be a trap. The Swedish advance seemed unstoppable. City after city surrendered. Protestants, once fractured, rallied beneath the blue and gold banner. Even hesitant princes now begged for alliance with Gustavus. Emperor Ferdinand II felt the tightening noose. The balance of the war had shifted dramatically. It was as if the divine pendulum, once favoring the Habsburgs, had now abandoned them. But war was never a stage of certainties. In 1632 came the fatal encounter, the Battle of Lutzen. The cold. Bit into bones, fog blanketed the field, and both armies knew this would be the decisive day. Gustavus Adolphus, true to his custom, did not command from afar. He rode among his soldiers, inflaming them with words of faith. Today we fight not only for ourselves, but for the gospel. He is said to have cried before the charge. The battle was ferocious, a whirlwind of gunpowder and steel. The Swedes advanced with courage, breaking imperial lines. But in the smoke, fate dealt its cruel irony. Gustavus himself was struck, fell from his horse, and vanished in the chaos. When the dust cleared, the news spread like thunder. The Lion of the North was dead. The Swedish victory was real, but bitter. The Imperials retreated, yet the heart of the Protestant cause bled. If Gustavus had been God's instrument, why had God allowed his death? The dilemma shook many. Preachers tried to explain. Some said he died a martyr, others that his mission was complete. But the truth was that his absence left a dangerous void. The roar that had once thundered now fell silent, and the future again looked uncertain. Even in death, Gustavus became legend. His daughter Christina would inherit Sweden's throne, but her father's memory lived on as myth. Pamphlets depicted him as the Moses of the North, who had led his people to the gates of the Promised Land, though he himself had not entered. The collective imagination turned his death into cosmic sacrifice, reinforcing the belief that the war was part of a greater spiritual drama written in the heavens. Meanwhile, politics pressed forward. Sweden remained engaged, but without Gustavus, its fire dimmed. The emperor sought to regain ground, while new actors prepared to enter the stage. Among them, one unexpected name: Cardinal Richelieu of Catholic France. The irony was brutal. Soon, Catholics and Protestants would fight side by side against the same enemy. The cross would be used as a mask for the crown, revealing how deeply the spiritual war was now entangled with calculations of power. But before that twist unfolded, Europe still savored the echo of Breitenfeld and the tragedy of Lutzen. For many, Gustavus's example showed that God could raise a man to change the course of history, but also that victory never came without pain. The spiritual war was not just about glorious triumphs, but about losses that tore at the soul of nations. And here the unsettling question arises: was the Lion of the North truly God's instrument, or merely another king using faith to justify ambition? The answer echoed silently in the hearts of millions still suffering the consequences. What was certain is that, with Gustavus Adolphus, European Protestantism had been saved from immediate annihilation. The map of the war had been redrawn, and the flame he kindled would not soon be extinguished. The blood of Gustavus did not only soak Lutzen, it nourished the narrative that the struggle must continue at all costs. The cross still stood high, but no longer as an exclusive symbol of faith. It had become a banner of power, manipulated by those who came after. The stage was now set for an unprecedented historical irony: the entrance of Catholic France against the Catholic Emperor. If the 30 Years' War had proven anything, it was that faith and politics rarely walked apart. But in 1635, France's entry into the conflict revealed something even more disturbing. Faith could be used against itself. France was a Catholic nation ruled by Louis XIII, but the true political mind stood behind the throne: Cardinal Richelieu. Clad in purple and cross, the cardinal seemed to serve the church, yet his ambitions stretched far beyond the altars. For him, the struggle against the Habsburgs was not about religious dogma, but about power and balance. Richelieu feared the expansion of the Habsburg Empire, which controlled not only Austria and Spain, but influenced vast regions across Europe. A continent dominated by them meant France's suffocation. Thus, the cardinal made a paradoxical decision: to support Protestants against a Catholic emperor. What looked like heresy was, in truth, the embodiment of what he called raison d'etat, the idea that the nation's interests stood above religious alliances. It was a scandal, but also a masterstroke. Suddenly, the spiritual war became even more confusing. How could French Catholic soldiers march side by side with Swedish Protestants fighting against fellow Catholics? Imperial pamphlets denounced Richelieu as a traitor to the faith, calling him a wolf in sheep's clothing. But in France, his rhetoric was clear. The cross could serve the crown because without the crown, the cross would lose its place in the world. It was a chilling inversion, the altar now subordinated to politics. With France's entry, the war reached a new level of brutality. The entire continent was now engulfed. What had begun as a Bohemian revolt had become a European cataclysm. French, Swedish, German, and mercenary troops swept across the land, laying waste to entire cities. Richelieu's logic was cold: weaken the Habsburgs at any cost. If that required burning villages, destroying harvests, and spreading famine, so be it. The cardinal believed he served a higher purpose: the survival of France. The war became an endless procession of horrors. Reports of cannibalism surfaced in famine-stricken regions. Chronicles told of peasants reduced to beggars, forced to choose between starvation or joining marauding bands. Diseases like plague reappeared, devastating both armies and civilians. Cities, once centers of commerce and faith, became open-air graveyards. With every passing year, it seemed Europe itself was approaching Judgment Day. Yet amid this hell, Richelieu stood out as the unseen conductor of war. He rarely appeared on the battlefield, but his influence was in every move. Secret correspondence, unexpected alliances, manipulation of princes, his mind wove webs of power that kept France at the center of the conflict. And while he proclaimed to serve the Church, he was undermining the Catholic emperor's authority. To many, it was proof that the spiritual war had been hijacked by human cunning. French and Swedish generals achieved major victories, such as the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, where the once invincible Spanish infantry was finally broken. The victory carried immense symbolic weight. It showed that even the pillars of Habsburg power could fall. French soldiers, some still clutching rosaries, raised their swords against Spanish Catholics. The scene was both paradoxical and disturbing. Faith, meant to unite, had become a pretext for brothers to slaughter one another. By this stage, the war was no longer simply Catholics versus Protestants. It was a struggle for hegemony, survival, and dominion. The spiritual mask remained, but thinner each year. And here the painful question emerged. Had the spiritual war become merely a war of empires? Or had it always been that, only disguised in the language of faith? Historian Diarmaid MacCulloch described Richelieu as the architect of a theology of politics, where the cross was subordinated to the crown. For him, the lesson of the war was clear. When faith is used as an instrument of power, it becomes unrecognizable. That analysis still echoes today, reminding us that the manipulation of religion always leaves deep scars. While Richelieu wove his web, the people of Europe paid the price. Entire villages vanished, maps were redrawn in blood. Children grew up never knowing peace, their only world one of marching armies. For many, faith had turned into trauma. Priests and pastors, once spiritual shepherds, became recruiters urging youths to sacrifice themselves in endless battles. The spiritual war was no longer only between Catholics and Protestants. It burned within every peasant wondering if God still heard their prayers. In 1642, Richelieu died. His imposing figure left a void, but his work was done. The Habsburgs weakened, France positioned as the new rising power. His successor, Cardinal Mazarin, would carry on the war with the same ruthless logic. The cross remained subordinated to the crown. Yet Richelieu's death also stirred bitter reflection. Many wondered if this cardinal, who had sacrificed millions in the name of reason of state, would be remembered as the savior of France or the betrayer of the faith. Perhaps he was both. With France firmly committed, the war entered its twilight. The continent was exhausted. 30 years of blood had turned cities into ruins, fields into deserts, hearts into ashes. And while cardinals and emperors still wrestled for power, one question grew louder. How much longer could this war go on? It was time to seek peace, not out of love, but out of survival. And so, Europe's eyes turned to a place where faith and politics would be forced to negotiate. Westphalia. There, in long and complex treaties, spiritual war would give way to modern politics. But by then, Europe had already been irreversibly transformed. The cross and the crown would never be seen the same way again. When Europe finally dragged itself to the negotiating table, the continent looked like an altar of scorched stones. Between 1644 and 1648, in Münster and Osnabrück, exhausted delegations arrived carrying crosses, swords, and debts. The emperor, German princes, France, Sweden, Spain, the Netherlands, and the Swiss Confederation all sent men trained more to suspect than to trust. Papal Nuncio Fabio Chigi watched, powerless, at the contradictions of his own century. The spiritual war that had set chapels and thrones ablaze now had to learn to speak in clauses, seals, and signatures, as though peace itself were a political sacrament. Mercy, however, was scarce. The twin congresses worked like alternating lungs. When one inhaled concessions, the other exhaled suspicion. Spain maneuvered to preserve roots and prestige. France, guided by Richelieu's legacy and Mazarin's hand, sought to contain the Habsburgs. Sweden demanded compensation in Adib, the Baltic and northern Germany. German cities pleaded for protection from endless levies and plunder. At the center, the emperor was forced to accept the unthinkable, sharing authority with princes who, for decades, had learned to live without him. Christendom was debating borders, but above all, limits, of kingdoms, of confessions, and of human ambition itself. Exhaustion spoke louder than conviction. Westphalia consolidated something new without declaring heresy, the idea of sovereignties that did not automatically bow to Rome, nor to any single altar. The princes of the empire won the right to forge external alliances so long as they did not threaten the emperor, formalizing an autonomy the war had already made real. The old principle cuius regio, ius religio, was reaffirmed and expanded. Not only Lutherans and Catholics, but Calvinists, too, were recognized. The normal year of 1624 was set to define possession and worship in ecclesiastical territories, reducing the chance that future theological disputes would turn into armed campaigns. The sword withdrew, reluctantly. Territories changed hands like consecrated chess pieces. France obtained parts of Alsace, strengthening strategic corridors. Sweden received western Pomerania, along with Bremen and Verden, opening maritime and commercial influence. Brandenburg Prussia was compensated to the east. Bavaria retained the Upper Palatinate and the electoral title it had won during the war, while a new electorate was created to restore the Palatinate's dignity to Frederick's line. The Netherlands and the Swiss Confederation had their independence, formally recognized. Each clause was a cartographic scar. Each gain, a reminder of a price paid in bones and silence. But the clause that would shape centuries was less visible than borders. The notion that political units could coexist side by side, negotiating without a universal sword hanging over all. Later, they called it the balance of power. To some theologians, it sounded like a renunciation of Christian unity. To others, it was the minimal protection of neighbor against manufactured apocalypses. Pope Innocent X protested vehemently, but his echo was faint. Western Christendom entered an age of uneasy coexistence, armed truce, divergent catechisms, weary diplomacy. Sanctity gave way to prudence. It was a hard lesson, but necessary for survival. Westphalia also curbed the prince's compulsion for internal missions. In practice, it multiplied spaces of tolerance, however timid. Private freedom of worship in several territories, restitutions, legal guarantees for minorities. The imperial diet gained confessional parity in decision-making, limiting sectarian surprises. The fatal memory of 1624 was fixed as normality, intended to prevent every change of throne from igniting a domestic crusade. The result was not heavenly peace, but decompression. Spiritual war did not vanish. It retreated to pulpits, universities. Letters and schools, forced conversion lost prestige, power learned new liturgies, treaties, embassies, congresses, and some measure of moral responsibility. For Christian faith, the settlement was both wound and invitation. Wound, because it confessed the defeat of the dream of unity imposed by the sword. Invitation, because it suggested another path, persuasive. Witness, concrete service, holiness that convinces without canons. Lucid preachers began to see politics with more skeptical eyes. The cross was never meant to be a scepter. The gospel, being good news, does not flourish in the soil of terror. Wedgwood and Wilson, writing centuries later, insisted that the trauma shaped a Europe less credulous toward messianic promises. Suffering raised questions that no treaty could fully answer. Yet not all was virtue. Peace also brought coldness. Rulers learned to choke their consciences with ruthless calculations, while the people rebuilt roofs and graves. The diplomacy of mistrust, so effective in preventing holy wars, sometimes blocked necessary compassion. Some princes treated minorities as bookkeeping entries, tolerated only while useful. In many regions, reconciliation never came. What came was forgetfulness, the poor cousin of forgiveness. Still, compared to the previous decades, the new arrangement saved countless lives. It was not the kingdom of God, but it was a possible refuge for starving children, widowed poor, and reborn villages slowly returning to life. Perhaps the deepest lesson was theological. The attempt to turn Europe into an armed church had proved a curse. Westphalia did not deny faith, it denied the political monopoly of faith. By recognizing plurality, it taught that if Christian truth is of God, it does not need canons to endure. It needs saints who wash wounds and rulers who know their limits. The peace raised one great question for public conscience. How can human dignity be protected when angels are recruited into soldiers' lists? They answered with rules, dates, signatures. Not sublime, but a humble guardian of life for dark times. The final map emerged from chancelleries as an icon of survival. Germany remained a mosaic of powers. France rose as continental apex. Sweden guarded maritime gates. Spain entered a long twilight. The Holy See protested in vain. The masses returned to their fields, relearning the rhythms of seasons and the liturgy of bread. Spiritually, an appeal lingered. Purify Christianity of its thirst for domination. Perhaps the unknown martyrs, slain without chronicle, were the true authors of peace. They still cry today without voice. Govern with limits. Pray with humility, remember the poor. That is the hardest frontier of all. The 30 Years' War ended on the papers of Westphalia, but the echo of its flames never ceased. The continent rose from the ashes, redrawn in borders and bound by clauses, yet spiritually scarred forever. What began as a struggle for Christian truth ended as a pact of political survival. The altar gave way to the negotiating table. The cross, once wielded as a sword, was forced to relearn the path of witness, and we, 4 centuries later, still feel its weight. Modern Europe was born out of the trauma of a spiritual war that forgot the meekness of Christ and turned churches into fortresses. Every devastated field reminded the world that faith used as a weapon leaves ruins deeper than any cannon. Westphalia did not bring the kingdom of God. It brought the bitter lesson that ruling without limits leads only to the desert. Perhaps the greatest revelation is not in the redrawn map, but in the awakened conscience. When faith and power become confused, it is always the people who lose. When the cross is seized by the crown, hope is turned into mourning. But when faith is lived as service, not as domination, it remains light. And now I ask you, to what extent do we still confuse the crown with the cross in our own time? If you want to continue this journey of historical revelations, subscribe to Faith and Power, share this video, and help more people see that the past still whispers warnings to the present.